The Strange Man in the Snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared. He was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area, miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills, but I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing and had started down alone. My eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C., Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. The Curse of the Doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Cla found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Cla looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Cla, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll. Seemingly unaware of the curse, she was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. The shadow of an eccentric person. Maggie had been staying at her friend's apartment in this remote town for the past few weeks. The old apartment was the perfect escape for her from the chaos of life. But the peace she sought was quickly overshadowed by an odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the walls. Lily moved around the living room, tidying up a bit. She noticed there were quite a few mirrors hanging on the walls, as her friend was a collector of mirrors. But those mirrors gave her an inescapable feeling that they held something more. As she passed by one of the mirrors, for a brief moment, she felt as though something, or someone, was staring at her. She wasn't sure and brushed it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. She picked up a few scattered items from the coffee table and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. That night, Lily prepared to take a bath. She was tired and wanted to relax, to forget the strange feeling creeping into her thoughts. She turned on the faucet to fill the bathtub, steam filling the room. But as she was waiting for the tub to fill, her eyes suddenly caught sight of the mirror above the sink. She felt as if something was moving. Maggie startled, turning around, but there was no one in the room. The air was heavy with silence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly exited the bathroom, her thoughts spinning. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just stress from being alone in a strange place. One night, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she noticed a noise, or something moving. A shadow was cast on the floor. She felt an unease unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She didn't dare move. Her anxiety grew. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Maggie turned, opened her eyes, and there he was, a tall, pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes standing right behind her. Maggie jumped up, rushed to turn on the bedside lamp, but her hand slipped, and she knocked it over. As the lights flickered, the room lit up intermittently, but she couldn't see anyone. Then everything didn't stop. Shortly after, she heard a soft tapping on the window behind her. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and opened the curtain, but there was no one there. She panicked. It felt like a staged prank, as though something terrible was happening. She tried once again to shake it off and left the bedroom, but she didn't realize a man had appeared, standing silently, staring at her. He didn't move, just stared at her with eerie stillness. Days passed, and she began losing track of time, her mental state deteriorating. The reflection of the man started appearing more often, sometimes standing motionless at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. For the first time, he physically appeared, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in filthy, tattered clothes. Fear consumed her as she backed into the corner of the room. He was slowly approaching. His face twisted into a sinister grin. In horror, he lunged at her. Maggie was shoved into the large mirror, shattering it into a cacophony of sharp, piercing noise. As she fought back, the man screamed,
"You will be mine."
He gripped her wrists tightly, but in the chaos, he momentarily lost focus, distracted by his own delusions. Desperate to free herself, Maggie grabbed a shard of broken glass and, with all her strength, stabbed his hand. He howled in pain and released her. Maggie seized the moment of his distraction to escape. She ran out of the apartment, calling for help from anyone nearby. Soon, the police surrounded the apartment, and he was captured. He was an abnormal, deranged individual who had been living in an abandoned house nearby for years. He was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility after being diagnosed with severe mental instability and a history of violent behavior. The police believed he had been stalking Maggie for weeks before his outburst. Even though he was captured, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirrors in the house still reflected something strange. The trauma lingered within her, and it would take a long time for her to recover. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned Blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old Blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years, and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot, The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. The mystery behind a portrait. Moving in with Eric was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, but the moment she crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill enveloped her. Jamie's gaze settled on a large painting prominently displayed in the living room. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and piercing eyes. From the moment she saw it, she felt deeply uneasy. The woman's eyes seemed strangely alive. Jamie shivered, feeling the weight of those eyes on her. She thought it was watching her. She glanced at Eric, who was arranging painting supplies nearby.
It's just a painting, Jamie.
He reassured her with a soft laugh, but something inside her didn't agree. As Jamie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's piercing gaze. It felt as though the woman in the painting wanted to tell her something. Then one night, she had a nightmare, the woman stepping out of the painting. A cold hand gripped her arm, and the woman in the painting whispered one chilling word.
Run.
Jamie jolted awake in panic. She could still feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into Jamie. After another sleepless night, she asked Eric to move the painting out of their shared space, and reluctantly he agreed. He moved it to his office, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. Instead of feeling relieved, things only got worse. He spent hours in his office with the painting, muttering to himself in soft, frantic whispers. When he appeared, his arms were scratched and bruised, as if he had fought with something or someone. Jamie's suspicion grew. One night, after Eric had fallen asleep, Jamie gathered her courage and snuck into his office, determined to uncover what was going on. As Jamie got closer to the painting on the wall, the woman's eyes now looked fiercer than ever. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to take a photo with her phone. Jamie began researching the image. Her heart sank as she found an old article. The woman in the painting was real, a young woman named Anna who had disappeared years ago. The last person seen with her alive was her boyfriend, who also vanished without a trace. She looked closer at the image of Anna. There was an eerie coincidence, her earrings. They were identical to the pair Eric had given her on their 1-month anniversary. With fear rising, Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for more clues. She noticed a white cloth over an easel, as if Eric was preparing to start a new painting. But what caught her attention was a knife lying next to his paintbrushes. Suddenly, Jamie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the painting, and this time, Anna's expression had changed. Her mouth twisted and moved, forming the exact word Jamie had heard in her nightmare.
Run.
Jamie turned around, panic engulfing her. Eric was standing in the doorway, his face darkened with anger. He began asking her what she was doing there. Jamie backed away, but he continued advancing, gripping the knife tightly and saying that she knew too much. As he raised the knife, Jamie bolted, running down the hallway as fast as she could. She ran toward the door, fumbling with her phone to dial 911. But Eric was faster. He grabbed her by the neck just as she reached the front door, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard sirens blaring outside. The police burst in. They quickly subdued Eric, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and screamed in rage. While searching the house, the police found ample evidence behind a hidden door in Eric's basement. Behind it was a small, dusty room filled with Anna's belongings. But the most chilling discovery was Anna's decaying body hidden in Eric's basement. Finally, her spirit was set free. Before leaving, Jamie returned to Eric's office one last time. Anna's painting still hung on the wall. Her eyes were gentle, her face no longer twisted in fear or sorrow. Instead, she looked at Jamie with gratitude. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough. and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove down a deserted highway, my headlights barely piercing through the torrential downpour. I was a solitary traveler, accustomed to nights like this, navigating strange roads in search of new experiences. As I saw a sign emerge from the darkness, "Welcome to Cottage City," a wave of relief washed over me. Shelter was near. I pressed on, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. I drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town felt almost frozen in time. One house caught my eye, a crumbling structure by the roadside, abandoned and eerie. The walls were spray, painted with words like "Keep Out, Demon," and "Don't Look Back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone was trying to ward off something within. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out into the rain, turning on my flashlight. I stood outside, the light catching the faded words, and when I shone the beam toward the house, I froze. In the upstairs window, a boy stood staring down at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his red, swollen eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just gazed at me with an empty stare. I shivered and called out, "Hey, are you here alone, boy? Do you need help?" I mentioned that I was looking for a place to stay. The boy tilted his head, his expression unchanged, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, questioning why I was there and suggesting I shouldn't be in this place. He began to speak. "Are you here to meet her?" It was an odd question, one that filled me with dread. I thought this place was abandoned. I asked why he was here alone and where she was. Then, inexplicably, he broke into a strange smile and told me, "Her? She's waiting for a replacement." His gaze shifted to something behind me, his expression turning to one of horror. A strong wind blew through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched me from behind. I turned around to see a creepy old man standing behind me with a lantern, his bewildered face wondering why I was standing in front of this abandoned house. I stammered, explaining that I was just a traveler, seeking shelter from the storm. I told him about the boy I had seen in the window, but he insisted that I must have imagined it, even though I knew what I had seen. I learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and he told me that if I wanted, I could stay overnight at his house. He made me feel strange, yet I accepted his invitation. It was hard to fathom that the boy I had seen in the abandoned house was just my imagination. But something told me this man knew more than he let on. The old man's house looked as ancient as its exterior. The furniture was old, the walls covered with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. He led me to a seat by the fireplace. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask him about the house. He told me that many years ago, he moved here with his father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so he quickly made friends with a boy named Roland. Roland's family was large and boisterous, always filled with laughter. Roland's aunt, a warm woman, always had candy for the children, especially for him. But one day, she passed away suddenly. The whole family was grief-stricken, everyone except Roland. He didn't shed a single tear, didn't say a word. He just stood at her funeral, frozen and silent, his eyes vacant even as they lowered her into the ground. He had changed since that day, hardly going outside and spending hours alone in his room. Ronald was always in his room with his Ouija board. He used to say his aunt had taught him to use it, and Ronald would sit for hours trying to communicate with her. As he continued his story, I could almost visualize the events unfolding. Something had shifted in him that day, something dark and frightening. Then he continued telling me about what the boy had gone through since that day. Right after his aunt passed away, frightening things started happening in that house. At midnight, Roland's mother began hearing strange noises coming from his room at night, scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping the walls. Roland lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. He felt a presence, something lurking beside his bed, watching him. Henry leaned forward. He told me how Roland had confided in his older friend, saying he felt eyes watching him every night as it stood at the edge of his bed, silent but terrifying. The next morning, Roland's mother checked his bed and found scratch marks on the mattress. And more than that, his mother found them on Roland's own skin. Roland would scream, sometimes laugh loudly in the middle of the night. His voice changed, becoming rough, distorted, and pained. Roland's mother would rush in, only to find him alone, trembling, his eyes filled with fear. He told her about them, strange, shadowy figures. They all gathered around his bed, staring with their hollow mouths open in a silent scream. They all thought Roland was different. Everyone knew something was invading him, but no one could stop it or help him. I shuddered as the old man recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Roland's family called in priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was among them, placing a cross under Roland's pillow, hoping to drive out whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, Latin whispers filling the room. The exorcism became chaotic. Roland writhed on the bed, growling like an animal as if the cross caused him unbearable pain. Furniture flew across the room, and the cross seemed to burn him, driving him into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from his mouth, mixed with a raspy laugh. His body twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Roland, and he endured immense pain. During the exorcisms, he would roll and vomit, spit, speak in Latin, then laugh uncontrollably. His voice was like a demon from the depths. Once, during an exorcism, Roland suddenly broke free from the priest's grip and lunged at the metal bed frame. He swung it wildly, striking a priest's arm, forcing them to halt the exorcism. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Roland's body as if someone invisible was carving them with a sharp knife. On the final night, 3 priests performed Roland's last exorcism, even witnessing his body levitating. When they recited the final incantation, Roland's body fell motionless onto the bed. Everyone believed he was cured. Roland's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw him again. Neighbors avoided the house, cursing it. Some families even moved away due to strange occurrences. He told me that some believe Roland's spirit never left, that he's still trapped in that house. I shuddered, recalling the boy in the window grinning at me, his eyes dark and hollow. I told the old man what I'd seen. Hesitating, as I said the boy looked no older than 14. The old man nodded slowly, saying that was Roland's exact age when he vanished. I was stunned by what I'd heard. The old man pointed to a small room under the stairs, suggesting I sleep there. He warned me again to stay away from the exorcised house, then went upstairs. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the boy from my mind. I wondered what would have happened if he hadn't come. Could I have been the next, just as the boy had said? The sun finally rose, and the memory of the night clung to me like a shadow. I thanked Henry and left, but the questions remained. Did Roland die during the exorcism? His soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed him? But one thing was certain, I would never return to Cottage City again. Whispers from the mirror. I never thought that agreeing to sleep over at Thomas's house would lead to a nightmare. Thomas was always a bit odd, but as his desk mate, I'd grown used to his quiet nature. He was shy, and our conversations were mostly one-sided, with me doing most of the talking. Thomas was shy and strangely odd, but over time he began to open up. He smiled more often, though there was something unsettling about his smile that I couldn't shake off. One day, out of the blue, Thomas invited me to sleep over at his house. At first, I hesitated, but my curiosity about his mysterious family got the better of me. But as soon as I arrived, something felt off. Thomas's parents greeted me with the same unsettling smile he had, their eyes unnaturally wide. They were overly polite, and their voices held a forced cheerfulness that gave me chills throughout dinner. I could hardly focus on the food because I kept hearing something strange. A faint, distant crying, as if a child was sobbing somewhere in the house. No one else seemed to notice. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was so persistent that I finally had to ask Thomas. He just shrugged, his expression unreadable, and told me not to worry. After his parents went to bed, Thomas turned to me with a big grin and asked,
"Do you want to meet my old friend?"
His tone was cheerful, but something about it made me hesitate. I thought about it for a moment, but I didn't want to seem scared or cowardly. So I nodded, trying to hide my unease. We tiptoed down the dark hallway, the only light coming from the moon outside. I was most surprised by the Donovan family's apparent fascination with mirrors, lining them along the hallway walls. At the end of the hallway, we stopped in front of a large object covered by a cloth. The sobbing sound grew louder, echoing off the walls. Thomas stopped and whispered,
"Don't worry. If he looks at you, just make sure you look away quickly, and you'll be fine."
I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask, he pulled off the cloth, revealing an ornate mirror. Its intricate carvings wound around the frame like vines. But the most unsettling part was the sound of the crying. It seemed to come from within the mirror itself. I stared, as if hypnotized, as my reflection faded. Instead, a boy stood there, a boy I didn't recognize. I wanted to believe it was some kind of optical illusion, but then the boy turned and slowly started walking toward me. "Who is that, Thomas?" I asked him, but Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there with a puzzled smile. His face looked stretched and distorted like in a funhouse mirror, his lips curving into a strange smile as he reached out, pressing his hand against the glass. Suddenly, his fingers started pushing through the surface of the mirror, reaching toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Thomas yanked me away, shouting at me to look away. He pulled my arm, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath as I moved away from the mirror. His laughter echoed faintly, then faded as he slipped back deep into the mirror. We hurried back to Thomas's room, where he quickly locked the door behind us. Then we climbed into bed. When Thomas finally fell asleep, I lay there, my mind spinning. I had to get out of that house. I quietly slipped out of bed and headed for the door. Footsteps echoed behind me. Panicked, I hid behind the nearest door, peeking through a crack. Mr. Donovan, Thomas's father, walked past, holding a mirror. His voice echoed down the hallway.
"He's gone."
Without another thought, I rushed down the hall, desperate to escape. Around me, mirrors reflected different terrified faces, followed by the wailing cries of children. I finally reached the garage, slammed the door shut behind me, and grabbed my bike. I pressed the button to open the garage door. As soon as the door opened, I saw Mr. Donovan standing in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. He lunged toward me, stumbling in his haste, and the mirror he was holding slipped from his hand. It shattered on the floor into pieces. Long, bony arms reached out from the shards, grabbing Mr. Donovan. His screams echoed through the garage as the hands pulled him into the broken glass. Terrified, I jumped on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, leaving the house and the horrors inside it behind me. I didn't stop until I was far from the Donovan house. When I finally looked back, the house was just a distant silhouette. The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. he heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses with sunken eyes stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. Hell, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, Something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes, it was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. "We need to get to the car." We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us.
Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens. and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening. and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispering, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
She said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, "Jan?" I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, The train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and I called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet, but they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree. shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with a daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened, and tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. But when I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me. His eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, He turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked him to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road, cold, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then, the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. Tin, he took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting Delivery Trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. but I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over.